Hello and welcome to Mythic Mind, where we pursue wisdom on the paths between primary and secondary worlds. I'm Dr. Andrew Snyder, and I'm glad that you're here. Hey there, welcome back. Today we're going to be continuing with our material from the Fiction and Philosophy of C.S. Lewis course with the main content on Perelandra. Now, before we get to that, I do want to remind you that my current course on Plato, Stoicism, and Till We Have Faces is now underway. And so if you want to get that lumped in with the courses that are coming up, make sure that you become a Tier 3 annual member this week. That is, it's currently August 4th, and so you have until the end of August 9th. Become a Tier 3 annual patron to get access to this course, to the Elder Scrolls and Philosophy coming up in the fall, the Silmarillion coming up at the beginning of 2026, and then this new course that is announced at the end of this episode. Now, if you wait until after this week, then at this point, the Plato Stoicism Until We Have Faces course will drop off that deal because it's already started. I'm kind of gracing in this week with the new course announcement. So make sure you do that to get full access to everything. Even if you don't have time to go through this course right now, you'll have indefinite access to all the material, and so you can go through it at your leisure at another point. Just head over to patreon.com/mythicmind, become a Tier 3 annual patron, get access to this course, the Plato Stoicism Till We Have Faces, and all courses that begin within that yearly term, as well as, of course, full access to the Discord, all of our Mythic Mind podcasts delivered into one feed, and so forth. But for now, let's go ahead and get into Perelandra, beginning with a rendition of C.S. Lewis's Evolutionary Hymn performed by Hannah Gilmore, the same Hannah Gilmore who just wrapped up a Latin course for us. And so if you want to learn introductory Latin, make sure that you check out Hannah's course. I'll link that in the show notes, and patrons of Mythic Mind get half off her course, and so make sure that you check that out. Send me a message if you need information about that. But for now, let's go ahead and get into Perelandra.
Lead us, evolution, lead us up the future's endless stair. Chop us, change us, prod us, weed us, for stagnation is despair. Groping, guessing, yet progressing, lead us, nobody knows where. Wrong or just
Hello and welcome back as we get ready for Perelandra. Now, before we get started, I want to give many thanks to our own Hannah Gilmore for giving us that great rendition of C.S. Lewis's Evolutionary Hymn. And we'll be looking at the lyrics for that in just a little bit later in this video, and I was kind of debating with myself as to whether I include that for Perelandra or whether I hold it off for That Hideous Strength, and in the end I settled on both. Really, we see one continuous theme building throughout this series. In Out of the Silent Planet, Weston is portrayed as this scientific progressive, right? He's concerned about the next step in human evolution. What is it going to mean for humanity to evolve, to progress, to turn into whatever it is that comes next? We saw a lot of that really come out during Weston's conversation with Oyarsa, when Oyarsa brings up the fact that Weston seems to have this great love for humanity and for progress, but he doesn't seem to actually love any particular humans. So he has this love, this worship, this idolatry for simply man in the abstract and progress in the abstract without any clear understanding as to where it is that he's going. I think of that horrifying scene in Willy Wonka, the old one with Gene Wilder, where they're going through that tunnel. And he's singing things about, there's no knowing where we're going. The flames of hell keep growing. And so we're just kind of progressing. Who knows where? But ultimately, we aren't really progressing. We're actually descending. And we're going to see that play out in Perelandra. That in Weston's vain pursuit of reaching upward, he is in fact actually being pulled downward. And so what he sees as transcendence is actually a descent. It's a being brought low rather than being brought high. Those who most grasp for power are typically grasped by power. And remember, at the end of Out of the Silent Planet, in that final chapter and then in that postscript, Lewis comes out and tells us that Weston, which are put in quotation marks, and then he says, or the forces behind Weston are going to continue to play a leading role in the decades to come unless we do something about it. And so what are those forces that are at play in Weston? Well, in Out of the Silent Planet, it seems to be something like unbridled science. Science for the sake of science, advancement for the sake of advancement, without asking the question, what is it that we're advancing toward? And then we're going to see in Perelandra that the forces at work behind Weston might be something more diabolical, maybe even demonic. And so really the leading forces behind Weston, it's not just this scientism, it's actually something demonic, it's actually something diabolical. And then, of course, in That Hideous Strength, I won't give spoilers at this point, but we're going to see those threads really come together, where we say, okay, maybe the pursuit of progress for the sake of progress and the demonic are actually one and the same. Right? In many ways, Satan really is the quintessential progressive. He is moving away from established reality, trying to pave new paths, and that's something that we're going to talk about moving forward. But if you know your Milton, this is especially going to sound like Satan from Paradise Lost, right? He is the freedom fighter of sorts. He is somebody who falls in love with his own reason, his own creativity, and in so doing seeks to become his own god. And we, in turn, as the terrestrials living under this fallen archon, tend to do the same thing. We tend to follow his influence. And so it makes sense to include that evolutionary hymn in Perelandra as well as in That Hideous Strength. But now let's go ahead and get moving. All right, Perelandra. By the way, I love these old, 80s looking sci-fi covers in the older editions. All right, so Perelandra. Now we start off with what I think is just a brilliantly well done, creepy scene as C.S. Lewis himself, as the character in his story, is going to visit Ransom, and along the way he just starts to feel at dis-ease. He starts to feel anxious. He says, I was shocked to find that I mentally used the word afraid. Up till then, I tried to pretend that I was feeling only distaste, or embarrassment, or even boredom, but the mere word afraid had let the cat out of the bag. I realize now that my emotion was neither more, nor less, nor other than fear. And so he's met with fear. It's a very haunting walk from the train station to Ransom Cottage, and he starts to talk about why. Now, there are at least a couple things going on here. One part is that, we know as the readers, and Lewis himself will discover soon in the story, that one reason for his fear is that he is quite literally being haunted. He's being haunted by these Bent Eldila, by servants of the devil, that are trying to keep him from reaching Ransom's cottage. But also, he's just sort of dwelling on all of these things that are wrapped up in who Ransom is now. And especially his engagement with the community of spiritual beings, the Oyarsa of Mars, the Eldila that have continued to visit with Ransom. And he finds this all very unnerving because it's kind of like fairy tales becoming real. And when fairy tales become real, your understanding of what reality is starts to fall apart. And in turn, you start to lose a context for who you are and for the things that are valuable. As we're going to see in conversations toward the end of the story, you start to lose your center. You start to lose perspective over what is actually valuable. And you start to enter into the perilous realm, as Tolkien would call it. This is the realm where the categories that you have are upset. And you have to find a new path. And you have to find out how this fairy tale logic works. What is real? How do you even operate in this kind of setting? And so not only is he being haunted, but he's thinking about what it means to live in this strange new world that he's finding himself in. I'm going to try to refrain from reading long passages in this video because, well, you've already read this yourself. But I do want to read this because it gets at an important theme that we see throughout Lewis, as well as perhaps particularly in the Ransom series. So Lewis writes, "The truth was that all I heard about them, that is the Eldila, served to connect two things which one's mind tends to keep separate, and that connecting gave one a sort of shock. We tend to think about non-human intelligences in two distinct categories, which we label normal and supernatural respectively. We think in one mood of Mr. Wells's Martians or his Selenites. In quite a different mood, we let our minds loose on the possibility of angels, ghosts, fairies, and the like. But the very moment we are compelled to recognize a creature in either class as real, the distinction begins to get blurred. And when it is a creature like an Eldil, the distinction vanishes altogether. These things were not animals. To that extent, one had to classify them with the second group, but they had some kind of material vehicle whose presence could, in principle, be scientifically verified. To that extent, they belonged to the first group. The distinction between natural and supernatural, in fact, broke down, and when it had done so, one realized how great a comfort it had been, how it had eased the burden of intolerable strangeness which the universe imposes on us by dividing it into two halves and encouraging the mind never to think of both in the same context. What price we may have paid for this comfort in the way of false security and accepted confusion of thought is another matter." And I think I talked about this in the Out of the Silent Planet video, where in On Stories, Lewis talks about how there are really at least two different kinds of fears we can have. We can have a fear of what something might do to us, but we can also just have a fear that something is. The very existence of something, say a ghost, a fairy, maybe even an angel, right? Even those of us who might say confessionally we believe in angels, that's a very different thing than actually believing that angels are, in the primary world, that there are spiritual realities taking place around us and in the cosmos that we can't neatly classify into our material understanding. Because again, even those of us who aren't necessarily materialists, philosophically speaking, very much live like we are a lot of the times, if we're honest. And so coming to terms with the fact that there really are things that we can't neatly categorize in material terms, that is kind of upsetting. It's upsetting to our understanding of reality. It's upsetting to our understanding of what's really going on, of what is valuable, of kind of where the center of things is to be found. But Lewis is constantly trying to upset this. In Planets in Peril, David Downing says, "But Lewis wants to subvert the reader's certainty about the barriers between the natural and the supernatural, between myth and history. He is hoping that, after finishing the Ransom trilogy, readers may give every peculiar slant of light a second look, and think, perhaps, why, that's only the moonlight flittering through the trees, and yet, for a moment." And so Lewis wants to give us this enchanted worldview, where maybe things are not always exactly as they seem. Maybe there is a richness to this cosmos that does not fit neatly within the boundaries of our typical ways of understanding. Remember, the realm of fairy is the world that contains things that live kind of on the borders of perception, the borders of understanding. And maybe, just maybe, we live in a kind of fairy tale that our modernist presuppositions are simply unable to see. And then Downing goes on to say, "Throughout the Ransom trilogy, as well as the Narnia Chronicles, Lewis's strategy is to make readers sense that his fantasy world is more real than they might have supposed, and that their, quote, real world is more filled with the fantastic than they might have supposed. I include in this week's module his essay, Myth Became Fact, which pairs very well with Tolkien's essay on fairy stories, in which he says that the gospel contains a fairy story. But what Tolkien and Lewis are both getting at there is not saying that the gospel isn't real. What they're saying is that the gospel is the true fairy story. It is the ultimate melding of the supernatural and the natural, of the spectacular and the mundane. It is the myth that became fact in history. So Lewis talks about how there are many different pagan myths of, some god dying and rising, who knows when and who knows where. But what we get in Christianity is the real thing. Right? We get the transcendent God who enters into the natural sphere at a specific point, at a specific time, in a specific place. And so what we have here is the ultimate melding of the fantastical and the mundane, the supernatural and the natural. And so if you're operating under the Christian worldview that Lewis has, then we should absolutely have enchanted vision. We should absolutely recognize that the natural world is by no means simply natural, that the natural world is nested into a supernatural reality, and that is the most real thing. And then continue this theme about how simply the existence of something might be upsetting, might cause a certain mood within us, regardless of what it actually does. In On Stories, Lewis says, "The dangerousness of the giant is, though important, secondary. In some folktales, we meet giants who are not dangerous, but they still affect us much the same way. A good giant is legitimate, but he would be 20 tons of living, earth-shaking oxymoron. The intolerable pressure, the sense of something older, wilder, and more earthly than humanity, would still cleave to him." And he goes on to say that there's a certain reality to giants, that there should be such a thing that instills within us the kind of mood, the kind of feelings, the kind of sensations that a giant would instill within us. And for that reason, there is a kind of reality to the idea of giants, regardless of whether or not, factual giants ever lived. The idea of a giant is something real. It is something that should impose a certain mood, a certain feeling upon us. And so I just bring this in to talk about how, again, the existence of something, regardless of what it does, whether it's good or bad in the case of giants, simply the existence of a giant, the supposed existence of a giant, should do something within us, and that is a real and that is a natural relation that it causes. And so too with the Eldila and with Lewis. All right, so Lewis, or the Lewis character, eventually makes it to Ransom's cottage, and he stumbles around in the dark as, Ransom isn't there right now, and he trips over this strange object, which at first he can't really see well in the dark, but eventually he realizes it is coffin-shaped. And so this introduces this death theme, that death is going to play an important role. Now, take note of the fact that Ransom is being commissioned by the Oyarsa of Mars. Mars, who is the patron influence over both warriors and over martyrs, right? You can even see Mars, the word Mars, in the word martyr. And so this is the influence that gives resolute strength, either in victory in combat or in death in a noble martyrdom, standing against the bent forces that are working against you. In either case, your positive relationship with the Martian influence is going to lead you to maintain rigid straightness against a bent world. And so he is going to both engage in combat, but also he is going to experience a kind of death. Symbolically speaking, Ransom is going to die on Perelandra and be born again, and in so doing, he is going to give life to Perelandra itself. And we'll see that as we move forward. But right now, we just have this as an anticipation of things that are going to happen. And another thing I should say on this, because this is actually going to introduce a theme that we're going to see throughout Lewis's stories, especially when we get to Till We Have Faces. And I can also think it's an application here with Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe, as well as the Silver Chair. But more on that when we get there. But for now, what I want to point out here is the fact that, so Perelandra is the planet, it is the influence of love, of desire. Remember what we talked about with medieval cosmology here. And so she is the planet of love, of desire, of comfort. She is a feminine ideal. And what we see here is that Ransom, commissioned by Mars, which is the masculine ideal, right? He is going to be received into Perelandra, just as a coffin is received into the earth. And now I don't want to get too weird with this. I don't want to get too Freudian with this. But as we move on, we're actually going to see that we're going to move in a very un-Freudian direction. But I do want to emphasize the fact that he is being sent by Mars, the masculine planet, to be received into Venus, even as a coffin is received into the ground. And we'll just leave that there for now, but I want to at least highlight that theme here on the introductory level. But now we'll keep moving. Now, as Ransom is explaining to the Lewis character that he's been commissioned for this task that he doesn't really understand, right? He's being sent to Perelandra. He doesn't really know why. And he anticipates that the Lewis character might think that, Ransom sees himself with some kind of megalomania, that, that he's something really special. And Ransom pushes back against that. And he says, don't imagine I've been selected to go to Perelandra because I'm anyone in particular. One can never see, or not till long afterwards, why anyone was selected for any job. And when one does, it is usually some reason that leaves no room for vanity. Certainly, it is never for what the man himself would have regarded as his chief qualifications. I rather fancy that I'm being sent because those two blackguards who kidnapped me and took me to Malacandra did something which they never intended, namely, gave a human being a chance to learn that language. And so, part of the reason why he's being sent to Perelandra, part of the reason why he's qualified, is because he knows Old Solar, right? He knows the language that is spoken on other planets. He knows the language of the heaven. But this isn't something that he acquired by himself. It's not something he possibly could have acquired by himself, unless he were kidnapped and brought to Malacandra to begin with. And this is something that happened, on one hand, because bent men, Weston and Divine, kidnapped him and brought him there against his will. But ultimately, even that was an act of divine providence working through bent souls. Remember, I talked about in the previous video how when Ransom first encountered Weston and Divine gives us a by Jove when he recognizes who Ransom is. And that is a key to the reader that ultimately what's happening here is not just blind happenstance. Right? Ransom didn't stumble anywhere in the grand scope of things, nor was it entirely random that Weston and Divine happened to kidnap him. No, ultimately, Jove, Jupiter, Christ himself was orchestrating all of these things, using even bent Hanau in order to make a straight line that would bring Ransom into the great celestial dance, and in so doing, allow him to bring others into that dance as well. And so there is a straight line that's happening, even working through bent souls. And this makes me think of the Silmarillion. And if you don't know your Silmarillion, and specifically the Ainulindale, the beginning section of the Silmarillion, which tells Tolkien's creation myth, right? You have all of the Ainur, you have the gods. To stick with our study, maybe we can even call them Oyarsu. They are all singing songs together in harmony, in praise of Eru, the god figure, and in so doing, they are laying the foundation of what will be the created material order. But Melkor, who is the Satan figure, he starts to sing his own tune. He tries to bring the music in a different direction, one that ultimately centers around him, right? He is the progressive figure. He is the Satan figure. But Eru, he stops the music and he addresses Melkor, and he says, "And thou, Melkor, shalt see, that no theme may be played that hath not its uttermost source in me, nor can any alter the music in my despite. For he that attempteth this shall prove but mine instrument in the devising of things more wonderful, which he himself hath not imagined." And so Melkor keeps trying to sing these discordant tunes. He's trying to disrupt the harmony, but Eru, the great conductor, keeps moving the music and incorporating what Melkor is doing in order to create something even more beautiful against the will and against the intentions of Melkor. And so we see that God is ultimately in charge, using even broken, even bent, even sinful intentions, and he's reworking them, bringing them around to serve his good purposes. And so I think we see that playing out in Ransom. That Meldil worked through Oyarsa, worked through Weston and Divine in order to get to Ransom. And of course, through Ransom, he's going to work to redeem, he's going to work to glorify Perelandra, as well as everything else that Ransom does afterward. And then Ransom goes on to explain that what he's being called to do is really not that different than what any of us are called to do. As he says, "But when you come to think of it, is it odder than what all of us have to do every day? When the Bible used that very expression about fighting with principalities and powers and depraved hypersomatic beings at great heights, our translation is very misleading at that point, by the way, it meant that quite ordinary people were to do the fighting. And so this is the biblical charge, that not just the great and powerful, but that you are called to fight with demons. As crazy as that sounds, but that is exactly what we are told to do in Scripture. And that is exactly what Ransom is set out to do. And so while his tale is more mythical, it seems to be more extraordinary, the essence of what's happening is not all that different than what you and I are called to do according to Scripture. And then I kind of already talked about this idea, but I think it's worth bringing up. In Deeper Heaven, Christina Hale says, Ransom's role in Perelandra demonstrates his growth from a simple pilgrim to a martial prophet. Everything he learned on Malacandra, from the language to the martial influence, had prepared him to take up the prophet mantle. And so again, he's really going to be a stand-in for Malacandra, or for the Malacandrian spirit, for the martial influence, as he enters into Perelandra. And so what we have here is, remember how I talked about before, that Lewis tends to give us really an upward string of particulars that lead us to a universal, that lead us up to the realm of being, up to capital R reality from the lowercase r realities. Well, ultimately, that's what's happening here. What we're going to see play out between Ransom and the Lady of Perelandra really are particular interactions that are going to spiral upward to a greater reality, a greater kind of stability. And perhaps we chiefly see this actually in Perelandra, considering the fact that they spend most of the story on these moving islands, and then it ends in glory on the stable island, where Ransom receives his chief revelation about what's really going on in the cosmos. And so we get this movement from shifting particulars, from moving shadows to form, to universal, to capital R realities, to the ideals. And so this is not just a story about what Ransom is doing on Perelandra. Ultimately, this is a story about the relationship between Mars and Venus, between Malacandra and Perelandra, and in turn, their relationship is about a higher reality. And so again, it spirals all the way upward until eventually we get to God himself. And once we get that trajectory straight, then everything between where we are and that endpoint, that beatific vision itself, becomes glorified. Right? This is a very medieval idea, and I've talked about this before, that when you have your vision straight and you're able to see what it is at the end of the chain of being, then everything between where we are now and that chief end of all things becomes glorified as an extension of that end, of that reality. Everything gains purpose. And so that's the kind of vision that we're meant to have here. A vision that's looking upward and outward. A vision that continually moves us further up and further in to reality. We'll talk about that more as we continue on. Okay, so he hops in his coffin, and then Malacandra himself, the Oyarsa of Mars, shoots him off to Perelandra. And I should bring up also the fact that Venus is closer than Mars, and so we see here that the conflict, that the battle is moving closer and closer to Earth, and of course that's where that hideous strength will focus. Now, as he's arriving in Perelandra, we get this description of the descent, which is very different than the description we get of the descent into Malacandra. Remember, when he's descending into Malacandra, it's violent, it's sickening. We're told it felt like pregnancy sickness, but much worse. And that's because they were coming in contact with something that made them feel heavy. It made them feel burdened. The ground was rough. It was hard. It's like hitting rock. And this is because the Martian influence is the masculine. It is hard. It is firm. It is harsh. Remember when Malacandra said that he would have just disembodied all of them if he had the authority to do so. And so this was a harsh influence. This is a masculine influence. This is a warrior influence. Whereas Perelandra, however, is very different. Ransom doesn't exactly land on Perelandra as much as Perelandra receives Ransom. Right? He just sort of sinks down, and then we're told that the casket that he was in fades away. And so we really see that he was received by Perelandra rather than landing on her. She welcomes him in. And again, I don't want to get too Freudian with this, but I do think that there is some sexual imagery here that isn't pointing to something like sex. It's actually pointing to something higher. But I do think that there is some of that symbolism at play here when you look at the description of how he, this agent of Mars, is being received into Perelandra. So on one hand, he's being in a casket that's being laid into the earth that is receiving him. At the same time, I think that there is some kind of interplay here between the masculine and the feminine, and I think these are ideas that need to be brought together and that will be brought together as we move forward. And by the way, I should have mentioned this at the beginning. There's so much going on in Perelandra as far as the story goes, but I mean philosophically, symbolically, mythologically, that I'm going to save some of the more abstract conversation. Things like things about gender, things about exactly how Lewis is using mythology within his Christian framework, and a lot of that I'm going to lump together into a separate video that I'm going to provide for you after that Hideous Strength. That way we can pull on themes kind of throughout the books, and I think we'll have what we need for a very orderly presentation that's going to make a lot of things very clear. And so there's some things in Perelandra that I'm not really going to touch, or I'm at least only going to hint at in this video, that I'm going to bring into a broader level of conversation once we finish the Ransom series. And so I just want you to know that I'm going to be hinting at a lot of things, as I've kind of already done, that I will be talking about in more detail at another time. So just keep that in mind. Well, anyways, okay, he's received into Perelandra. And we're told, unlike as he was landing on Mars, when he felt sick and heavy and burdened, and it was really a bad experience, now we're told that he's feeling excessive pleasure, which speaks to the particular influence of Perelandra, right? This is a place of sweetness, of pleasure. This is a place of beauty, of love. Malacandra is that which asserts itself. Perelandra is that which receives. And so there is a sweetness, there is a pleasure, there is a welcoming here. And what really makes this strange for him is that he has excessive pleasure, but he doesn't have guilt. Typically on Earth, right, when we are experiencing excessive pleasure, a lot of times there is something sinful wrapped up in that, but that's not what we see here. What we see here is pleasure in the right context. And I think it's also worth pointing out the fact that, Ransom was to not wear clothes, right? He was naked for this entire trip. And brought together with what we see here, it makes me think of Genesis. Therefore, a man leaves his father and his mother. In this context, perhaps his father's Malacandra, and perhaps his mother is Thulcandra, and he clings to his wife, and they become one flesh. And the man and his wife were both naked and were not ashamed. And that's exactly what we see playing out here. That Ransom, as he enters into the warmth of Perelandra, he is clinging to his wife, he is clinging to love, and they are becoming one flesh. And again, his casket's fading away, he and Perelandra are sort of melding together, and they are both naked and they are not ashamed. And so we see some Eden imagery playing out here. In fact, in one of his letters, Lewis talks about how the Queen of Perelandra is supposed to be some kind of mix between Eve and the Virgin Mary. Now, Ransom encounters the Queen of Perelandra. They have some conversation. One of the first conversations they have is about this idea of receiving the wave that is sent to you. She says, "You think times have lengths. A night is always a night, whatever you do in it. As from this tree to that is always so many paces, whether you take them quickly or slowly." I suppose that is true in a way, but the waves do not always come at equal distances. I see that you come from a wise world, if this is wise. I have never done it before, stepping out of life into the alongside and looking at oneself living as if one were not alive. Do they all do that in your world, Piebald? Now, I do briefly want to highlight this Piebald nickname that he receives. This is a reference to the fact that he is sunburned on one side and pale on the other side as a result of one side of him facing the sun during his journey. And I think that this connects to the dream that he had back in Out of the Silent Planet. Remember when he was straddling the wall and he had one leg in the light, one side in the darkness, one leg in the known, one leg in the unknown. And so this is continuing that theme here, the fact that Ransom straddles two realities. He is a bridge. A little bit ago we said that he was a prophet. Well, he's also a priest of sorts. And we're going to see that play out even more in the next book. He is a bridge between earth and the heavens. He is bringing things together in himself. And so Ransom sees time happening objectively, whereas the lady experiences time subjectively. Not in the sense that time depends on her, but she experiences time rather than looking at time. I think that's the quintessential difference. Whenever she learns something, she says that she's getting older, whereas she was younger before she knew something. And so something about the expansion of knowledge, the expansion of understanding. Time is relative to internal progress or internal movements rather than external things happening. And so she says that she experiences time, she experiences life, whereas Ransom is leading her to look at life, to look at things changing rather than to focus on the change that you yourself are experiencing, or rather your relationship to the change around you. And so she refers to this as looking into the alongside and looking at oneself rather than actually living. And this points me to Lewis's essay found in God in the Dock called Meditation in a Toolshed, in which he says, "I was standing today in the dark toolshed. The sun was shining outside, and through the crack at the top of the door there came a sunbeam. From where I stood, that beam of light, with its specks of dust floating in it, was the most striking thing in the place. Everything else was almost pitch black. I was seeing the beam, not seeing things by it. Then I moved so that the beam fell on my eyes. Instantly, the whole previous picture vanished. I saw no toolshed, and above all, no beam. Instead, I saw, framed in the irregular cranny at the top of the door, green leaves moving on the branches of a tree outside. And beyond that, 90-odd million miles away, the sun. Looking along the beam and looking at the beam are very different experiences." And so the lady only knew how to look along the beam. She experienced reality rather than studying reality abstractly. And in this essay, Lewis goes on to point out the fact that in our modern world, we tend to prioritize looking at the beam, where we want to understand the phenomenon that is happening in material terms, rather than looking along the beam and experiencing the glories that the beam provides for us. And so we tend to disconnect ourselves from actually experiencing reality, from actually embracing reality. Whereas the lady, led by the influence of Perelandra, is somebody who naturally embraces reality. But Ransom here inadvertently causes her to step aside from that and to judge reality rather than embracing reality. And this is a thread that the Unman is going to pick up and take even further. And then Ransom learns a little bit about redemptive history here. He learns that there will never again be any Hanau like those of Malacandra, but moving forward, any new Hanau will take the form of humanity because of the incarnation. Right? Because the beloved became man, how should reason in any world take on another form? And, at first Ransom doesn't like this very much because, he liked the diversity. He liked the creatures of Malacandra. He wishes that there were more such things. And I can't help but to think that this has some relation to Lewis's own appreciation for paganism, which he says that on an aesthetic level, he actually prefers pagan mythology to Christian mythology. He likes Greek mythology more, he likes Celtic mythology even more, and Norse mythology most of all. However, he sees the most beauty in Christianity because it is a true myth. But that beauty is tied to its truth. On an aesthetic level, he does have some appreciation for paganism, for the old times, the things that came before. I can't help but to think that there is something of that going on in this conversation. But nonetheless, Ransom does receive the wave that is sent to him, which is exactly what he is supposed to do. You receive the wave that Meldil sends your way. You don't fight against it. You don't determine the currents. You don't send any waves back. You don't create the waves. Your obligation is to receive the wave that is sent to you. And then same thing about Eldila. There are no Eldila on Perelandra. And the lady brings up the fact that the Eldila are part of an older reality, that they were on Earth and they used to have more power on Earth. But ever since the incarnation, they've been overthrown. They don't have the same power that they used to, even though they do linger still. This leads me to think that, maybe we are correct in identifying the Oyarsu as angels, but maybe the Eldila are something like fairies that used to have more of an influence, but have been largely overthrown. And, even still, they're around, but don't have the same power that they used to. And I think that this is going to tie into some of what we're going to see in that hideous strength. But I'm going to save this for my broad level mythology and philosophy video, and so we'll just let that linger for now. But to the specific point at hand that I'm kind of drawing on, this points to the fact that things change, things are moving in a different direction, and what we're called to do is not to hang on to the wave that we want the most. What we're called to do is to hang on to the one who sends the waves. This very much makes me think of Boethius' Consolation of Philosophy, in which Boethius talks about how we aren't to attach ourselves to changing fortunes, but we are to develop the appropriate relationship to fortune itself, and ultimately to providence itself. And so that seems to be going on here. Now, to again hint at some of the broad level stuff that's going on the philosophical and on the gender area, Tinadril, the lady, says, "But how can one wish any of those waves not to reach us, which Meldil is rolling toward us?" And so the waves that Meldal sends are going to be sent. They are going to come our way. We simply have an obligation to receive them in the appropriate manner. This makes you think of something that we're going to get from That Hideous Strength, and forgive me for referencing a book that we haven't yet gotten to in our study, but I'm just going to do it this one time. Ransom, in That Hideous Strength, says, "What is above and beyond all things is so masculine that we are all feminine in relation to it." Now, this does not at all disrupt the relationship between the masculine and the feminine. It actually highlights it and points to the fact that, Meldal is the chief masculine influence in the fact that he asserts himself, he is strong, and he cannot be bent. He is resolute and he is steadfast, and he is the one who initiates. And so he sends forth the waves, and all Hanau have an obligation to receive the wave. And so again, we get some of this masculine-feminine relationship playing out here. One sends, the other receives. One pursues, the other is pursued. And now after this, we see the next morning star. And remember, the morning star is both Venus as well as a title for Satan. And so we see this play out. It's written, then, quite involuntarily, he added in English, "By Jove, what was that?" She also had exclaimed. Something like a shooting star seemed to have streaked across the sky, far away on their left, and some seconds later an indeterminate noise reached their ears. "What was that?" he asked again, this time in Old Solar. "Something has fallen out of deep heaven," said the lady. Her face showed wonder and curiosity. But on Earth, we so rarely see these emotions without some admixture of defensive fear that her expression seemed strange to him. And of course, this description of him shooting across the sky, falling out of the heavens, makes me think of Isaiah. "How you have fallen from heaven, O morning star, son of the dawn." And so here we have Weston, we have the unman, we have this devil falling from the sky, falling from the heavens. Or Christ also says that he saw Satan fall to the earth as a streak of lightning, which very much points to this imagery that we're getting here. And with the arrival of Weston, we get what I like to call the cult of progress. We get the progressivism that we saw in Weston in Out of the Silent Planet, really brought into a religious framing. And this is going to play out throughout Perelandra, as well as into That Hideous Strength. And I put a lot of text on the PowerPoint, so you can download this and look at it. I'm not going to read all of it for the video, but I do want to point out some things here. So he talks about how, as a physicist, he focused on the conflict between man and his non-human environment. But now he's plunged into biology, and now he's concerned with life, with the relationship between the organic and the inorganic. And what he develops from this is an evolutionary philosophy, not just a scientific belief in the process of evolution, but an evolution-based philosophy that very much ties into Hegelianism, this idea that the most fundamental reality is something like reality creating itself across time. It's this idea that there is a life force, that there is a cosmic spirituality that is continually moving closer and closer to heaven, to utopia, to paradise, that God is, in a sense, creating himself over time through the unfolding of cosmic history. And perhaps especially so through the unfolding of rational life and the development of reason. Hegel used to talk about how history is the process of the absolute discovering itself or becoming conscious of itself. Well, this kind of philosophy is definitely at play with Weston right now. He says, I saw almost at once that I could admit no break, no discontinuity in the unfolding of the cosmic process. I became convinced believer in emergent evolution. All is one. The stuff of mind, the unconsciously purposeful dynamism, is present from the very beginning. And so, again, this idea that all of reality is one thing that's discovering itself across time, that evolution is moving in a positive direction, that is continually making things better and better and better than what came before. And this is he refers to this as something of a break from his previous philosophy, but this really is his philosophy in Out of the Silent Planet, right? When Oyarsa challenges him to even define what he means by man, and he doesn't really know. All he means is what it is that man produces. And so this is an intentional movement away from metaphysics, from anything like a transcendent ideal. This is moving away from a fixed reality that we are to conform ourselves to, such as Plato would give us, and this is instead a movement into the unknown, with the unknown being just accepted as necessarily good. This is the philosophy of Satan. It is change for the sake of change, progress for the sake of progress without any clear understanding of what it is that we're progressing into. And so change itself becomes good. He goes on, man in himself is nothing. The forward movements of life, the growing spirituality is everything. I say to you quite freely, Ransom, that I should have been wrong in liquidating the Malacandrians. It was a mere prejudice that made me prefer our race to theirs. To spread spirituality, not to spread the human race, is henceforth my mission. This sets the coping stone on my career. I worked first for myself, then for science, then for humanity, but now at last for spirit itself. I might say, borrowing language which will be more familiar to you, the Holy Spirit. And so now he's trying to couch this in Christian theological terms. He's going to try to argue that, what he's saying is basically what Ransom believes, that they're on the same page here. And this kind of philosophy, well, maybe not put in such explicit terms, is very much alive today, right? Whenever someone talks about they want to be on the right side of history, well, that then implies that history itself is alive, that history itself has a right side and a wrong side. And the question of, how do we know what's right and what's wrong? Well, the answer, I suppose, would be, whatever comes next is right and is the standard by which we judge what came before. And so the progress of history itself becomes our standard for the right and wrong side of history. Movement itself is simply good. And so that philosophy is actually rampant in our world today, whether it's embraced consciously or unconsciously. And I think the most diabolical part of all of this is that then he tries to pass this off as essentially Christianity, the same Christianity that Ransom has. And I think that so much of Weston's philosophy, so much of modern and postmodern philosophy is contained very well in this hymn that we started this video off, C.S. Lewis's Evolutionary Hymn, which you've already heard, but let's go through the lyrics here, and I'm not going to sing it, I'm just going to read it for you. Lead us, evolution, lead us, up the future's endless stair, chop us, change us, prod us, weed us, for stagnation is despair, groping, guessing, yet progressing, lead us nobody knows where. Wrong or justice, joy or sorrow, in the present, what are they, while there's always jam tomorrow, while we tread the onward way, never knowing where we're going, we can never go astray. To whatever variation our posterity may turn, hairy, squashy, or crustacean, bulbous-eyed, or square of stern, tusked or toothless, mild or ruthless, towards that unknown God we yearn. Ask not if it's God or devil, brethren, lest your words imply static norms of good and evil, as in Plato, throned on high. Such scholastic, inelastic, abstract yardsticks we deny. Far too long have sages vainly glossed great nature's simple text. He who runs can read it plainly. Goodness equals what comes next. By evolving, life is solving all the questions we perplexed. Oh then, values mean survival. Value, if our progeny spreads and spawns and licks each rival, that will prove its deity. Far from pleasant by our present standards, though it may well be. And so here we have it. There is no good or evil. There is no standard for judging what ought to be. All there is movement. Evolution, change, progress is the ultimate good. And so despite the fact that Weston is trying to pass this off as the same kind of spirituality that Ransom has, is actually the exact opposite. Because, Christianity, as well as Platonism, teaches that the ultimate good is stable, it is static, it is being and not becoming, it is ideal, it is substance, it is not shadow. Whereas Weston is saying just the opposite, that there is no static good and is no static evil. All that there is change. And what we need to do is keep changing. And why should we change? Well, so we'll be different. Why should we be different? So that we can keep changing. And so evolution becomes this circular reasoning where we're trying to move, we're trying to progress simply for the sake of moving, simply for the sake of progressing. This is, in every real sense, a satanic philosophy. And it most certainly is the philosophy of Weston, or at least the forces behind Weston. And so he continues to try to gaslight Ransom into saying that, we believe basically the same thing, you're just using different terminology. And Ransom again says, no, it kind of sounds like you're saying the opposite. They go back and forth, but ultimately what we get here is a sort of a Tashland situation. And I don't think this is a big spoiler, but in the last battle of Narnia, there's an attempt to merge Aslan with this false deity Tash into Tashland as a way of saying, they're really just two ways of saying the same thing. And so we see this theme is going to get repeated in Lewis's literature. And then Weston goes on to talk about how this god, this world spirit, is discovering itself, it's creating itself over time. And Ransom here, he notes the difference between what Weston is saying and what he believes as a Christian. That for Weston, we are pursuing change. For Ransom, for Christianity, we're actually pursuing that which has always been. We're not pursuing something that's temporal, we're pursuing the eternal. We're pursuing the stable, we're pursuing the unmoving. And so what Weston is proposing here is the exact opposite of what Ransom embraces. And again, more of this conflation here between God and Satan, between real progress and regress. All right, let's keep moving. And then in the midst of this speech, just kind of all of a sudden, we get this horrifying passage where it says, "Then horrible things began to happen. A spasm like that preceding a deadly vomit twisted Weston's face out of recognition. As it passed, for 1 second, something like the old Weston reappeared, the old Weston staring with eyes of horror and howling. Ransom, Ransom, for Christ's sake, don't let them..." And instantly his whole body spun around as if he had been hit by a revolver bullet, and he fell to the ground and was there rolling at Ransom's feet, slavering and chattering and tearing up the moss by handfuls. I think that really the most horrifying scenes in this entire book are those times when Weston, the real Weston, seems to be there, somewhere present. And Ransom isn't even sure when this happens, if this is genuine, if Weston is somehow still there, or if it's some kind of trick in order to get sympathy for the devil. It's not really clear, but just the idea that, okay, if Weston, the real Weston, a real human, as vile as he may be, that a real human is there somewhere, well, that is the horror. And that is what causes us, or at least causes me, causes Ransom, to feel some genuine sympathy for Weston. That it doesn't matter that he's a villain, he's still a human, right? He's still made in God's image. He still is someone who's supposed to be in a different state of being. And Lewis talks about this somewhere. I can't remember where offhand. I feel like it might have been Four Loves, because reading that recently, maybe somewhere else. But regardless, he talks about how, okay, we should experience a genuine hatred for what is evil. But at the same time, when somebody does what is evil, we should also feel sorry for them. Even if, yes, of course, they're responsible for the evil that they did, well, we should feel sorry. We should feel regret that they did such a thing for their own sake. That we should have a genuine compassion for those who are, or those who have given themselves over to evil. Because we're still dealing with a human being, and that should give us a kind of love, a kind of compassion, a kind of sympathy. Even when we're told that God does not delight in the death of the wicked, but desires that all come to repentance. And I'm not trying to get into right now the broader theology of predestination and all that. I think that's a conversation worth having, just not in this context. But nonetheless, that verse is given to us for a reason, that we should have a kind of compassion even for vile sinners, recognizing that, but for the grace of God, there go I. And so these are what I find to be the most disturbing passages, where it seems like a real Weston is there somewhere amidst the unman. Now, this philosophy of the cult of progress that we just saw Weston lay out in his monologue really becomes the driving temptation that he tries to give to the Lady of Perelandra. Weston encourages her to think about what it would be like to live on this island that she's forbidden from living on. What would it be like to break this commandment that God has given you? And she says, that would be a strange thing, to think about what will never happen. Weston replies, nay, in our world we do it all the time. We put words together to mean things that have never happened, and places that never were. Beautiful words, well put together. And then tell them to one another. We call it stories or poetry. In that old world you spoke of, Malacandra, they did the same. It is for mirth and wonder and wisdom. What is the wisdom in it? Because the world is made up not only of what is, but what might be. And at this point, I think it'd be worth talking about Tolkien's idea of subcreation, which we see chiefly in his essay on fairy stories, which I referenced earlier. And so Tolkien talks about how, God is the ultimate creator, but we also, made in his image, are called to be sub-creators, meaning we work with the things that he has made in order to put things together in new ways that don't break from the harmony, that don't break from the order that God has sent, but actually point back to that order as we put things together with reason and with beauty and with wisdom. That's actually not what Weston, or the unman here, is proposing. What he's proposing is not really subcreation, but creation. He is encouraging her to step out into the void, step out into what is not, in order to determine what should be. And so he's trying to tempt her into not subcreation, but he's trying to tempt her into primary creation, into usurping the unique role of God, which again brings me back to the Silmarillion. We're told that Melkor had gone often alone into the void places, seeking the imperishable flame, for desire grew hot within him to bring into being things of his own. And it seemed to him that Iluvatar took no thought for the void, and he was impatient of its emptiness. Yet he found not the fire, for it is with Iluvatar. But being alone, he had begun to conceive thoughts of his own, unlike those of his brethren. So as with Satan, Melkor, the Satan figure of the Silmarillion, he goes off and tries to create things ex nihilo himself. He tries to take charge over being, which I think is something like the imperishable flame. It speaks to the independence of God and the fact that God alone is able to give being to contingent realities. And this is his unique responsibility that Melkor tried to usurp. This is exactly what the Unman is now tempting the Lady of Perelandra with. He is tempting her to be a primary creator rather than a sub-creator, to determine the waves rather than receiving and riding the waves. Okay, and then we get more of this kind of temptation. You can read these passages for your own on the PowerPoint, but I'll just keep moving. Same basic theme being unraveled here. Okay, and then as this theme does continue to develop, Weston, or the Unman, starts to cause her to separate out from herself. Remember when I talked about, in reference to meditation and Toolshed, how Ransom himself inadvertently started this process of getting her to stop experiencing reality and to reflect on it abstractly, to reflect on it so-called objectively, scientifically. So now Weston is going to try to move this further and is going to convince her that Mileldil really wants her to walk on her own, and that as long as she is looking along the beam, so to speak, and attaching herself to him in this direct relationship, well, then she's engaging in some kind of disobedience because he wants her to be independent. And so again, he's working on subverting her religion. He's working on subverting her experience, causing her to step out in judgment rather than to welcome the embrace of that which is chiefly good. And to this end, he gives her a mirror, which she finds disturbing. Fortunately, this tactic doesn't really work out, at least directly, but he's trying to convince her to see herself rather than to see herself in Mileldil, to see herself in God. He wants her to fall in love with her own beauty separately from the beauty that she has in that which is chiefly beautiful. And to the extent that she would do this, to the extent that she would see her own beauty in herself, she would actually end up losing sight of that which actually is beautiful. She would lose the experience of beauty by looking at beauty. Remember in the last video when I quoted from The Weight of Glory, which Lewis says that what we want to do is to be, embraced in beauty. We want to consume beauty and have beauty consume us. But no, now she's separating this out. She is looking in on herself as beautiful rather than seeing the beauty of giving herself over in love to that which is chiefly lovely. I think of this quote from Lewis's Letters to Malcolm when he says, "Any patch of sunlight in a wood will show you something about the sun you can never get from reading books on astronomy." And so too, simply experiencing beauty is going to show you something about beauty that you would never get from any book on aesthetics, that you would never get from simply looking at beautiful things and thinking, oh, that's beautiful. What we need to do is actually embrace beauty by giving ourselves over to that which is chiefly beautiful. And I'm using this repetitive framing of my language for a purpose, because all that is good, all that is true, all that is beautiful should be pointing us toward that which is chiefly good and true and beautiful. Right? Because if we're not doing that, if we're not following the particulars up to the universals, if we're not following the good that makes good things good, then what we're doing is actually giving ourselves over to the shadows, and in so doing, we're becoming shadows ourselves. Think to The Great Divorce if you've already read that. Okay, and then in another temptation, the Unman is telling the lady all of these stories about these brave women who have given themselves over, they've suffered losses, they've sacrificed, not ultimately for the good, but they've sacrificed for their own heroism. And all these stories sound very good, right? They sound like a way of praising the goodness, the strength, the power, the responsibility, the authority of women, the heroism of women. And then toward the end of the scene, we're told at the bottom here, the precise details were often not very easy to follow. Ransom had more than a suspicion that many of these noble pioneers had been what in ordinary terrestrial speech we call witches or perverts. And so he's using all these villainesses, but framing them in such a way that it seems like they have some heroism to them, some power, some authority. And so this is a perverted kind of love, because real love does sacrifice itself. Real love is heroic. Real love does give itself away, but doesn't give itself away simply for the sake of heroism. It doesn't give itself away simply for the sake of tragedy. No, it gives itself away for that which is chiefly lovable. Christina Hale says this really well. She says, instead, he introduces vanity into her love, the belief that there is some great thing that she must overcome in order to achieve true nobility. The unman attempts to make the idea of sacrifice more attractive by introducing a self-focus. This warped focus is what enables the suggestion that Meneldil actually desires Tenedril's disobedience to become believable. And so he's raising up the idea of sacrifice as such with this self-focus in a way that's going to cause her to see as liberation that which is actually imprisoning. She's going to confuse nobility with what's actually going to make her ignoble. She's going to confuse heroism and villainy. However, we're going to see coming out of this an example of true sacrifice, the right kind of sacrifice, and that's why I'm calling this section the ransom. Ransom hears a voice that says to him, "It is not for nothing that you are named Ransom. My name also is Ransom." And so here we clearly have Meneldil, we clearly have Christ himself communicating to Ransom. Ransom is going to follow in the ransom in Christ's footsteps. He is going to engage in a fight. He's going to engage in a sacrifice. He is going to be harsh as nails, so to speak. And through being as harsh as nails, by also being the ideal martyr, he is going to use the martial influence in the appropriate way, laying himself down for the lady, giving himself over for her love, and in so doing, she is going to be exalted. And this is the proper relationship between the masculine and the feminine. The masculine uses its strength in service of the lady, who is then exalted, and in her exaltation, he also is exalted along with her, as he joins with her, and so her glory becomes his glory as well. Or perhaps another way of framing all this is the masculine gives his glory to the feminine, and then she in turn gives her glory to the masculine. And so it is this interchange, it is this cosmic dance, which is language that we'll see toward the end. But already what we see here is these particular examples of the masculine and the feminine engaging with each other on a particular level that's going to move up to the universal. And so at this point, we're told that Ransom begins to have an absolute hatred for evil. But this is an appropriate kind of hatred. It is hatred for evil, and we should have hatred for evil. The joy came from finding at last what hatred was made for. As a boy with an axe rejoices on finding a tree, or a boy with a box of colored chalks rejoices on finding a pile of perfectly white paper, so he rejoiced in the perfect congruity between his emotion and its object. And so this is an appropriate kind of hatred. If you don't hate what is evil, then you can't possibly love what is good. Because if you love what is good, then you desire the good of good things. You desire that good things be conserved and upheld and glorified and put in their proper place. And if you love what is good, then you need to hate that which would do harm to what is good. You need to hate evil. You need to hate sin. You show compassion to a wolf, and you're going to lose your flock. And so if you love your sheep, you need to be willing to exercise hatred toward the wolf. And that's what we see here. This is when Ransom realizes that this conflict is not going to be a conflict of words. He needs to fight hand to hand. And so we get this brutal hand-to-hand combat between Ransom and the Unman, where they both get terribly wounded, they end up in the water, and eventually they are washed into this underground cavern. And so this contest is now going to take place underneath Perelandra, or within Perelandra. Remember the imagery at the very beginning of the coffin. He is now being laid to rest under the earth of Perelandra. This is where the real combat is going to take place. And remember the specific language we got from the weight of glory in the last video. Meanwhile, the cross comes before the crown, and tomorrow is a Monday morning. A cleft has opened in the pitiless walls of the world, and we are invited to follow our great captain inside. And so this is going to be the ultimate sequence of death and rebirth, of a contest in the grave that's going to give way to the glorification of the world. Right? As quite literally, Ransom goes into a cleft that has opened in the pitiless walls of the world. And now he is going to follow his great captain inside. He is going to play a Christological role here underneath the ground of Perelandra. And then with his Trinitarian formulation, we get the defeat of the Unman. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Ghost, Here goes. Amen, said Ransom, and he hurled the stone as hard as he could at the unmanned face. The unmanned fell as a pencil falls, the face smashed out of all recognition. And so, with a stone to the face, the unmanned falls, and that is the end of this conflict. However, Ransom was very wounded, but most of his wounds heal. But one wound does not heal, and that, of course, is the wound on his heel. We're told, but just as a man who has had a fall only discovers the real hurt when the minor bruises and cuts are less painful, so Ransom was nearly well before he detected his most serious injury. It was a wound in his heel. The shape made it quite clear that the wound had been inflicted by human teeth, the nasty, blunt teeth of our own species, which crush and grind more than they cut. And so, Ransom crushed the head of the unman, just as the unman wounded the heel of Ransom. This is obviously connected to Genesis 3:15. And I'll put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and hers. He will strike your head, and you will strike his heel. And so, Ransom creates this separation. He prevents the union between the woman and the devil, and in so doing, he crushes the head of his enemy, and he has his heel wounded. And so, obvious Genesis 3:15 playing out here in the story. Again, highlighting Ransom's Christological role here. It's not that Ransom allegorically is Christ, because Christ is actually in this story, right? Christ is Maleldil. Ransom, as we saw at the beginning of the story, is supposed to be seen as just another Christian who now, by virtue of being a human in the image of the incarnation, right, in light of the commissioning that comes with the gospel, Ransom is now called to do the kinds of things that Christ did, namely to fight the devil and to undo his works. And so Ransom here is not just giving us another telling of the gospel narrative, he's giving us a telling of what Christians are supposed to do, even though this is being told in a mythological format. And I think that the specific Christological imagery we get here really drives in this fact. Okay, after this conflict is over, Ransom eventually finds his way to the Holy Mountain, where the king and queen of Perelandra receive their glory. And a lot of this is really difficult to follow, and I think that there's some benefit in trying to rationally break down everything that we see, but I think it's really best just experience. If you've never listened to the audiobook, then this is actually one area where I would actually encourage you to listen to the audiobook, and I think you might actually get more out of it than reading. Now, normally I'm going to encourage reading whenever possible, real reading with paper and ink. However, there are certain sections of literature that I think are best to just listen to and have read over you, kind of let it wash over you. And I would definitely put the last portion of Perelandra into that camp. Back at the beginning of the story, the Lewis character says, I was questioning him on the subject of his voyage to Venus, which he doesn't often allow, and had incautiously said, of course I realize it's all rather too vague for you to put into words, when he took me up rather sharply for such a patient man, by saying, on the contrary, it is words that are vague. The reason why the thing can't be expressed is that it's too definite for language. And this gets us back to the beam that is in the toolshed, that the most definite realities are experienced rather than abstractly rationalized. And so there's something about just the experience of love that is more real than any kind of definitions or any kind of philosophy we can give of love. The real experience of beauty is more real than any articulated philosophy of aesthetics. And so what Lewis is trying to get us to do here is to embrace reality, right? You want to know what love is? Well, give yourself over to that which is worth giving yourself over to, and you'll learn something about love, something that you'll never get out of a philosophy of love book. You want to experience glory? Well, behold glorious things, and you'll come to experience glory in a way that a definition or a philosophy of glory can never actually give you. And I think that's what we see here in this final sequence. What we see here is an experience of truth, goodness, and beauty. So with that in mind, I'm just going to read a little bit from this last sequence in Perelandra with fairly minimal commentary. But I will comment on more of this when I get into my broader mythology and philosophy video. But for now, I think it's worth just looking at. Now, Ransom's whole understanding of kind of what the center of reality is, what the center of history is starting to get moved around. He's starting to kind of lose track of what is our anchoring point in reality. And so he says, as soon as we think we see one as a center, it melts away into nothing, or into some other plan that we never dreamed of. And what was the center becomes the rim. till we doubt if any shape or plan or pattern was ever more than a trick of our own eyes, cheated with hope, or tired with too much looking. To what is all driving? What is the morning you speak of? What is it the beginning of? The beginning of the great game, of the great dance, said Tor. I know little of it as yet. Let the Eldila speak. And now the Eldila speak. The great dance does not wait to be perfect until the peoples of the low worlds are gathered into it. We speak not of when it will begin. It has begun from before always. There was no time when we did not rejoice before his face as now. The dance which we dance is at the center, and for the dance all things were made. Blessed be he. There seems no plan, because it is all plan. There seems no center, because it is all center. Blessed be he. Now remember how Weston talked about how reality is unfolding over time. It is creating itself over time. And so this is what makes progress a chief good, because it is in harmony with the reality that is continually progressing, continually advancing, continually evolving. This is an opposing philosophy to what the Eldila give us, when they say that the great dance is not waiting for people to discover it. It's not waiting for people to create it. It's not waiting for history. The great dance has always been taking place from eternity. Our role is to participate in that dance which has always been taking place, before always. And so it's a movement toward being, toward stability, toward actualization. And as we are moving in the appropriate direction, then all of our finite particular steps gain significance as they're wrapped up into the appropriate context, and we recognize the true center, which of course is God himself. He in whom we live and move and have our being. And so, there seems no plan because it is all plan. There seems no center because it is all center. Blessed be he. He has no need at all of anything that is made. An Eldil is not more needful to him than a grain of the dust. A people world no more needful than a world that is empty, but all needless alike, and what all add to him is nothing. We also have no need of anything that is made. Love me, my brothers, for I am infinitely superfluous, and your love shall be like his, born neither of your need nor of my deserving, but of plain bounty. Blessed be he. All things are by him and for him. He utters himself also for his own delight, and sees that he is good. He is his own begotten, and what proceeds from him is himself. Blessed be he. And so in other words, God doesn't need us. Nothing about us is needed. Nothing about anything is needed. God creates out of abundance. He creates out of an abundance of love, of Trinitarian love. And in fact, if you go to Mere Christianity, in referencing God's inner Trinitarian relationships, he talks about taking part in this dance, where each member of the Trinity plays its role in this glorified divine love that then moves the rest of the created order and summons it to participate in this love. And so a lot of that is what's playing out here as well. Now, to wrap up this video, I'm just going to read a couple more passages from The Weight of Glory that I think will end us on the right note in light of the themes that we've been discussing. We cannot mingle with the splendors we see, but all the leaves of the New Testament are rustling with the rumor that will not always be so. Someday, God willing, we shall get in. When human souls have become as perfect in voluntary obedience as the inanimate creation is in its lifeless obedience, then they will put on its glory, or rather, that greater glory of which nature is only the first sketch. For you must not think that I am putting forward any heathen fancy of being absorbed into nature. Nature is mortal. We shall outlive her. When all the suns and nebulae have passed away, each one of you will still be alive. Nature is only the image, the symbol, but it is the symbol Scripture invites me to use. We are summoned to pass in, through nature, beyond her, into that splendor which she fitfully reflects. Apparently, then, our lifelong nostalgia, our longing to be reunited with something in the universe from which we now feel cut off, to be on the inside of some door which we have always seen from the outside, is no mere neurotic fancy, but the truest index of our real situation. And to be at last summoned inside would be both glory and honor, beyond all our merit, and also the healing of that old ache. Be comforted, small one, in your smallness. He lays no merit on you. Receive, and be glad. Godspeed. Thank you for listening, and thank you to all of my patrons that make these various things that we're doing possible. And by name, I'd like to thank all Tier 3 patrons and higher, so many thanks to Mark, Aaron, Amanda, Andrew, Chase, Chaz, Christopher, Clinton, David, Don, Aaron, Evie, Adam, Jack, Jamie, Justin, Kyle, Paul, Roger, Ross, Tyler, and William. You all really just go above and beyond in funding the work that I'm doing here and allowing me to keep doing this and to keep providing more and just generally going further up and further in. If you'd like to support my work as well and support this entire fellowship, then head over to patreon.com/mythicmind. Even $5 a month gives you Discord access and open invitations to all of our podcasts, all the podcasts delivered early and ad-free for you. So again, any support does that for you. Make sure that you become a Tier 3 annual patron if you want to get access to all of my courses. If you're even interested in 2 or more, this is going to be the best deal for you. Patreon.com/mythicmind. But that's it for now. Stay tuned for the latest course announcement, and make sure that you catch the next thing coming out from Mythic Mind, which is going to be over on Mythic Mind Games on Friday. So see you then. Until then, Godspeed. The Psychology of Soren Kierkegaard, a 10-week course led by Dr. Andrew Snyder, coming in the spring of 2026. What if anxiety is not just a dis-ease to be cured or to be wished away, but is actually a revelation of one of our most fundamental freedoms? A freedom that is awakened by possibility. And I don't just mean the possibility of doing one thing or another, not just the possibility of what might happen to you or around you in this world of changing fortunes, but rather the possibility that's presented by our own will, of our ability to determine what it is that we are and where we're going to base our identity. Who are we? What is our essence? Where will we seek for stability in this changing world? What even are we in a world that is constantly given over to change and to uncertainty? These are questions that we answer at every single moment, although we often fail to recognize that there's even a choice to be made, let alone that we are the ones who are doing the choosing. Most people today answer these questions by claiming that we are whatever we want to be. There's no one to tell us no or where to go. Truth, goodness, and beauty, and even what it means to be human, is entirely up for grabs, because, as the secular existentialist Jean-Paul Sartre says, existence precedes essence, which means that we are thrown into this world without purpose or design. We have no boundaries, and we are all just making it up as we go along. Popular academia, and even well-meaning theological critics, often trace this thought back to Soren Kierkegaard, the 19th century Danish philosopher and so-called father of existentialism. However, as I argued in my doctoral dissertation, an honest reading of Kierkegaard will actually lead to very different conclusions. In this 10-week study, we will discuss 3 of Kierkegaard's critical and often very difficult psychological texts that formed the foundation for my dissertation. The concept of anxiety, the sickness unto death, and fear and trembling. The concept of anxiety provides a penetrating investigation into the experience and consequences of anxiety as the gateway to losing or finding oneself. The sickness unto death surveys the various forms that the loss of oneself can take, such as reality-denying hyper-imaginations, which run in the mainstream of today's thought, an inability to consider the possibility of change, or identification with transient things, and several other forms of despair, many of which often go undetected, at least for a time. Now, for a more positive outcome, Fear and Trembling focuses on Abraham's sacrifice of Isaac to demonstrate the leap of faith that results in one's true self. As Kierkegaard writes in one of his journals, "With God's help, I shall become myself." Whether you are interested in the history of ideas and you want to better understand Kierkegaard's role as a Christian who became dubbed as the father of existentialism, or you have more existential concerns, such as finding a better way to understand your anxiety as a potential pathway to living out your human purpose, or you want to root out underlying despair that seems to ruminate on the surface even in the good times when you stop to pay attention, or you want to discover what it means to live as a knight of faith, then join me in studying The Psychology of Soren Kierkegaard. You can enroll in the individual course from the shop at patreon.com/mythicmind, or become a Tier 3 annual patron and get access to all courses that begin within that yearly term. A definitive date will be provided as the course gets closer, but you can look forward to this study in the spring of 2026. To get the best value, be sure to head over to patreon.com/mythicmind right now and become a Tier 3 annual patron. I hope to see you there.